Critical theory, according to Thomas McCarthy, offers theoretically informed histories of the present with practical intent. Like all definitions of internally contested concepts, this one prompts as many questions as it settles. For example, which theories should be informing our histories of the present, and which ones should not? Should our theoretical orientation be primarily Kantian, or Hegelian, or Marxist, or Adornian, or Habermasian, or something else? How big is the tent of critical theory? Are thinkers like Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger, Foucault, and Derrida in the tent or out of it? And what of the work of critical theorists in the most Catholic sense of that term? Feminist, queer, and trans theorists, critical philosophers of race, post-de and anti-colonial theorists. How should critical theory in the Frankfurt School tradition be informed by these theoretical endeavors and perspectives? Relatedly, we might ask, what sort of history of the present best informs critical theory? A historically materialist theory of social revolution, a theory of social evolution, a la the early and one might say the very late Habermas, a normative reconstruction in the vein of Axel Honneth's Freedom's Right, a Nietzschean or Foucauldian genealogy, some combination of the above, or something else entirely. It's worth emphasizing, I think, that McCarthy's definition refers us explicitly to histories of the present. In other words, it presumes that the point of historical reflections for critical theory is not to tell us something about the past, but rather to illuminate something about our present moment. And moreover, to do so in a way that opens the present up to practical, emancipatory, progressive transformation. But what kind of history of the present is best suited to play this dual epistemological and practical role? This is the broad question that motivates my reflections on Rahel Jaeggi's recent book, Progress and Regression. Jaeggi's book brings together the traditions of Marxist Hegelianism and American pragmatism to develop a deflationary, non-teleological, multidimensional account of historical progress and regression. This account is designed to be responsive to the critiques that post and decolonial theorists, among others, have offered of traditional philosophies of history, whilst avoiding throwing the baby of historical explanatory diagnosis out with the teleological bathwater. For Jaeggi, progress and regression are not only defensible against common criticisms, but they are also indispensable for critical theory's mutually intertwined projects of social theoretical analysis and normative critique. Now, Jaeggi's reconstruction of the Marxist Hegelian idea of a logic of history is central to her defense of progress and regression. And it is this aspect of her project that I'd like to focus on tonight. My questions are as follows. What are the uses and disadvantages for critical theorists of understanding history as evincing a rational or developmental logic, however weak, pluralistic, and fractured that logic may be? Is the idea of a logic of history the best way to do the epistemological and practical work that critical theory needs histories of the present to do? And if not, what other ways of conceptualizing history might better serve this dual role? So I give you here just a little roadmap of the remainder of the talk. And I will start with a brief sketch of three possible ways of conceptualizing history and understanding its relationship to the emancipatory tasks of critical theory. So I just want to emphasize that this, what I'm about to present is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all the possible ways of understanding history, nor will I be able to do justice to the full richness and complexity of the views I'm going to discuss. The point is rather simply to offer a somewhat stylized sketch of the most prominent features of the current theoretical landscape so that I can then situate Jaeggi's project within it. So the first view that I want to discuss holds that history's value for critical theory lies in its ability to reconcile us to the norms, institutions, and practices that make up our social and political form of life. This conception of history is most influentially and elegantly articulated by Hegel, for example, in the closing paragraphs of his preface to the Philosophy of Right, where he writes, quote, "To recognize reason as the rose and the cross of the present, and thereby to delight in the present, this rational insight is the reconciliation with actuality, which philosophy grants to those who have received the inner call to comprehend." In other words, whatever the myriad shortcomings, failures, and disappointments of the present, reason lies at its core. We can be assured of this precisely because we can trace the rationality or the logic of the historical developmental process that got us to this point. Coming to this realization serves to reconcile us with our historical present and thus allows us to be free in Hegel's distinctive sense of that term, to be at home with oneself in another. Now, although there's certainly room for debate here, this reconciliation-oriented view arguably also animates the work of contemporary critical theorists like Jürgen Habermas and Axel Honneth in different ways and to different effects, and even if largely implicitly. For Habermas, autonomous, modern, post-conventional individuals can, and maybe even must, recognize the differentiated post-traditional societies into which they had been socialized as the result of a process of rationalization. And for Honneth, the methodology of normative reconstruction reveals the rationality embedded in the major institutional spheres of modern social orders, the family, the state, and the market. This broadly speaking Hegelian conception of reconciliation is often thought to entail a triumphalist reading of history, according to which, as Todd Hedrick puts the worry, quote, "It is incumbent upon people in the modern world to swallow the claim that their institutions represent the culmination of history," end quote. However, I want to be clear that this reconciliatory account of history need not be triumphalist in any naive sense of that term. Because it allows for a sizable gap between the rational norms, principles, and ideals that structure the modern world and their imperfect social, institutional, and practical realization, this view of history is perfectly compatible with the claim that there are significant gaps between the ideals of, say, freedom, equality, and democracy and their practical and material realization in modern social orders. Still, even if it need not be naively triumphalist, this view does require, as its conceptual counterpart, a retrospective philosophy of history that understands history as a story of progress. This philosophy of history can be contingent, deflationary, and multiplicitous, and it can make room for historical regressions, misdevelopments, and even catastrophes. But it must hold fast to the reconstruction of history as a story of progressive rationalization. That is, it must tell an essentially vindicatory story about, at the very least, the ideals that structure modern social orders, however sorry the state of their material institutionalization, if it is to serve the practical functions of reconciling us to our form of life, and thus of realizing freedom in the distinctive Hegelian sense of that term. So among the many criticisms that have been made of this approach, for our purposes, three stand out as particularly salient. First, at least in its initial formulation in Hegel, this view is essentially contemplative. Hegel associates freedom with a cognitive shift in our understanding of and relation to the modern world, rather than with a practical or material transformation of that world. As such, second, this view is often charged with being overly conservative and biased toward the status quo. Even if the Habermasian and Honnethian versions of this position have the resources to respond to these first two worries, after all, as I said, for them, a great deal of practical and material transformation is needed to fully realize the ideals of modernity. Still, they are subject to a type of status quo bias in that they rule out the need for and the possibility of the transformation of our normative ideals themselves. Third, and finally, to the extent that this view is invested in reconciling us to a specific set of ideals and institutions that emerged in European modernity, it is open to charges of Eurocentrism. So the first two of these concerns have led critical theorists, most famously Marx, to a second, more praxis-oriented conception of history. On this view, the value of historical reflection lies in its capacity to uncover the material conditions and historical tendencies that make revolutionary social transformation possible in the present. This view of history is encapsulated in the famous line from the opening of Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly found, given, and transmitted from the past," end quote. Understanding the circumstances that have been transmitted from the past, as well as grasping the logics of contradiction, negation, and Aufhebung through which history develops, on Marx's view, makes it possible to move beyond the essentially contemplative task of interpreting the world and to begin to change it. A central feature of this view, encapsulated in the notion of historical tendencies, is that its theory of history cannot be solely retrospective. If it is to enable emancipatory transformation, the praxis-oriented view must be able to connect its retrospective philosophy of history to a prospective account of the present historical and material circumstances that can support emancipatory social change. Without this connection, the praxis view can avoid neither the contemplative conservatism of Hegel nor the shortcomings that Marx diagnoses in utopian socialism. Unlike the latter, which, as Marx famously writes, are content with, quote, "writing recipes for the cookshops of the future," end quote, Marx's emancipatory vision is grounded in his analysis of current historical circumstances. In other words, the praxis understanding of history can serve its function of orienting us in the present only if it projects the logics and dynamics that structure its retrospective reading of history into the future. Now, to be sure, there is arguably a notion of reconciliation at work in this view of history as well, since the preservation through determinate negation, that is the work of Aufhebung, is itself a kind of reconciliation of the contradictions, negations, and even, for Marx, violence that fuel historical progress. This is, however, a more metaphysical, logical sense of the term reconciliation than the strictly historical one that I'm using here. With respect to historical reconciliation, the praxis-oriented view holds that this is in principle unrealizable under present historical circumstances, given the alienating, reifying, and dominating effects of the capitalist value form. Historical reconciliation thus demands a radical transformation of the modern social order. To the extent that Marx does posit a future moment of reconciliation as the culmination of existing historical tendencies, one could say that his conception of history also takes a vindicatory form, with the key difference between his view and Hegel's being that this vindication is incomplete. It awaits completion with the arrival of communism. Again, of the many criticisms that have been made of Marx's theory of history, three stand out as particularly important for this discussion. First, the consistency with which Marx and his followers regularly and confidently predicted the inevitability of capitalism's demise, a prediction that falls out of the historical tendencies that they identify operating in the present. This has led many critics to worry that his view is historically determinist. Even if I think one can defend Marx on this point by pointing out that he just as consistently insists that the overcoming of capitalism must be achieved through the revolutionary agency of the proletariat, and as such that his view cannot be straightforwardly determinist, this worry quickly gives way to a second, namely that his account is too objectivistic in that it places too much emphasis on a scientific account of material and historical dynamics and not enough on individual and collective agency and historical contingency. And finally, although this is the subject of heated controversy, there's a long-standing worry that Marx, like Hegel, indexes his account of historical progress to a set of ideals and institutions that emerge in European modernity, and that as such his theory of history remains Eurocentric. A third and final view of the value of history for critical theory emphasizes problematization. On this view, most powerfully articulated by Michel Foucault, The point of historical inquiry is neither to reconcile us with our present, nor is it to identify historical tendencies on which revolutionary praxis should build. It is rather to open up a space of concrete freedom within the present. The problematizing view of history accomplishes this by articulating problems that are central to our present, problems that crystallize in Foucault's work around psychiatry, the medical gaze, punishment, and sexuality, and at the same time by actively problematizing our relation to our present by bringing to light its historical conditions of possibility. In doing so, this approach not only reveals the contingency of our current practices and institutions, showing that they could be otherwise, but also unravels the complexity of their constitution, showing how they could be otherwise. This emphasis on the complexity of the historical constitution of our current practices and institutions means that the problematization perspective shares with the praxis-oriented view a commitment to a kind of materialism. However, unlike both the reconciliation and the praxis views, the problematization view leaves behind notions of historical reconciliation, whether these are rooted in the present or deferred to the future. It also breaks with Hegel and Marx's shared emphasis on contradiction and negation as the driving motor of the logic of history, highlighting instead the multiplicity of discourses and practices that make up our present and emphasizing moments of discontinuity and rupture in history. On this view of history, critique is, as Foucault himself famously put it, quote, a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we are doing, thinking, and saying. An investigation whose ultimate aim is to, quote, separate out from the contingency that has made us what we are, the possibility of no longer being, doing, or thinking what we are, do, or think, end quote. Now, among the many criticisms that have been put forward of this view of history, I will focus on three. First, there's what I call the one damn thing after another objection. The concern here is that given its emphasis on rupture, discontinuity, and contingency, this view ends up understanding history as nothing more than a random series of events, which amounts to nihilistically denying that it has any meaning at all. This objection fails, I think, to appreciate the seriousness of Foucault's claim that his is a history not of the past, but of the present. If the point is to illuminate something about the present, then whether this view attributes or denies meaning to the past in itself or qua past seems largely beside the point. The question rather becomes, do we as critical theorists need to attribute meaning to the past to do the work that we need to do? And if so, what sort of meaning and why? But behind this first worry, I think, is a second, which is that the emphasis on contingency, discontinuity, and historical rupture undermines any sense of directionality in history, and thus robs the problematizing view of the ability to orient our emancipatory efforts in the present. And a closely related third worry concerns the infamous problem of normativity. On what basis can the problematizing view support a critique of our present, given that it, like the first two views, eschews all transcendent supra-historical standards, while, in contrast to them, casting a skeptical eye on developmental norms such as progress and historical learning? Okay, so with that sketch as background, I turn now to the question of where Jaeggi's view fits into the sketch I just provided. And I think although there are some interesting points of connection between the problematizing view and Jaeggi's account of problem solving, and I'll explore those briefly later on, it seems fairly clear that she rejects what I'm calling the problematizing approach to history. However, it's less clear where she stands with respect to the first two options. After all, she frequently nods to Hegel, for example, when she claims that, quote, the Hegelian idea of a dialectically self-enriching experiential learning process thus emerges as central to the entire project, end quote, of her new book. And she also suggests more than once that her view of progress and regression is largely, if not entirely, retrospective. At the same time, however, she makes her concerns with what I call the reconciliation view of history plain in her critical remarks on Honneth. And her reconstruction of Marx's theory of history provides the backbone of her account of social change, which is utterly central, I think, to understanding her view of progress. So let's start with Jaeggi's critique of Honneth. This critique is embedded in a larger discussion of how progressive transformations occur. Jaeggi frames her argument with a discussion of what she calls the expanding circle and the institutional deepening views of progress. The expanding circle view, espoused by Peter Singer, holds that progress is a matter of widening the circle of our moral concern, or expanding our understanding of who counts as a moral agent. Honneth's institutional deepening view, by contrast, understands progress as a matter of more fully realizing our moral principles by deepening our interpretations of them and improving their institutional implementation. Jaeggi explains Honneth's view as follows, quote, "Where progress occurs, we move ever closer to what is intended by certain normative principles or is inherent in them, and we realize them in a more substantial or complex way in our institutions. The ever-improving interpretation and institutional realization of norms initiates a qualitative, sometimes even quite radical transformation of the practices and institutions in question," end quote. Now, Jaeggi prefers the institutional deepening view to the expanding circle position precisely because the former allows for the fact that our normative ideals themselves may need to be enriched and qualitatively transformed rather than merely extended to more groups of people. In other words, unlike the expanding circle view, the institutional deepening view, quote, "does not imply that we already have all the normative resources we need." Nevertheless, Jaeggi suggests that these two views share a common limitation. Neither allows for the possibility that our norms themselves might change, and that this change could also count as progress. As Jaeggi explains this point with respect to Honneth, quote, "Honneth is adamant that genuine moral revolutions, in the sense of a radical transformation of the given normative framework, are not to be expected in our current situation," end quote. By ruling out the possibility of radical normative paradigm change, these views are guilty of a kind of theoretical closure that Jaeggi is keen to avoid. Again, speaking of Honneth's view, Jaeggi contends that, quote, "excluding the possibility of a radical paradigm change is both arbitrary and impossible, and that there is no need for Honneth to make this claim." Now, for what it's worth, I disagree with Jaeggi on the point that there is no need for Honneth to make this claim. As Jaeggi herself notes, Honneth, quote, "clearly sees the breakthrough to modernity as progress," end quote. And as a result, he presupposes, I would say, that European modernity provides us with a set of norms that should be deepened and more fully realized. So why then does Honneth think that he needs to make such substantial claims about the progressiveness of modernity and the unsurpassability of its normative horizon? My sense is that he thinks he needs to make these claims to ground his own conception of normativity and avoid sliding into contextualism. Now, to be clear, I agree with Jaeggi that this move is problematic, and not only because of the problem of theoretical closure that she points out, but also because of the, I think, rather obvious Eurocentrism entailed in this position. But I think we should acknowledge why Honneth is motivated to defend such claims, even if only to clarify the distance between his and Jaeggi's views on this point. So, unlike Honneth, and I think to her credit, Jaeggi does not explicitly stake her account of progress on a substantive conception of modernity. Indeed, her account of progress is resolutely non-teleological in the sense that it specifies no preordained goals or ends of history. As she insists, quote, "societies do not have goals, they solve problems. Whether they progress or regress is not determined by how close they come to some normative goal, but by the quality of their problem solving, which is always the quality of their problem solving processes. Moreover, because she does not articulate any substantive criteria for what constitutes progress, her account is open to a multiplicity of progressive historical developmental trajectories. Her processual account of progress offers thin and formal, yet context-transcendent criteria for determining whether historical changes are progressive. Thus, Jaeggi contends she can avoid the dangers of contextualism and relativism, even as she, quote, breaks with a Eurocentric paternalist narrative of development, end quote. At the same time, Jaeggi holds on to the idea that history has a logic, or we might say that we can discern a logic in history, even if she understands this logic as weak, multidimensional, and fractured. Although she sometimes claims that this logic can be identified in hindsight or retrospectively, Jaeggi also seems to follow Marx in linking retrospective to prospective judgments about progress. And in fact, she hints at this when she adds that the logic of history can be identified, quote, in hindsight at least, end quote. Indeed, I don't see how we can make sense of her understanding of social change without presupposing a connection between retrospective and prospective judgments of progress. Jaeggi makes this point explicit when she claims that critical theory must develop, quote, some kind of narrative about how societies are transformed, end quote. She continues, quote, if we too do not simply wish to accept the world as it is, we need a narrative that breaks the spell of its facticity by illuminating its contradictions and crises, along with the possibilities of changing it for the better, end quote. And for this reason, Jaeggi argues we cannot relinquish the philosophy of history. But it's not clear why we would need this philosophy of history unless it is to orient ourselves in the present, to help us figure out what to do, to help us determine which past developments we should build on and which ones we should oppose or resist as regressions. As Jaeggi puts the point elsewhere, quote, we lose a lot if we cannot come up with a social theory that sees history as more than unrelated events. It is from within an understanding of an emancipatory or meaningful success of historical moments that we can judge trajectories of transformation, end quote. If the point is to judge trajectories of transformation, to provide an account of social change and dynamics that can orient us in the present and give us a sense of direction, then our judgments about progress or regression cannot be solely retrospective. They would also have to be extended or projected into the future, even if only provisionally. So considering Jaeggi's objections to Honnet's reconciliation-oriented understanding of history, and despite her own occasional protestations to the contrary, I think that her view is best characterized as what I've called a praxis-oriented model. Now, to be clear, I'm well aware that Marx himself was profoundly influenced by Hegel, and I happily admit that Jaeggi's work overall might best be characterized as Marxist Hegelian or Hegelian Marxist with pragmatism thrown in for good measure. And in fact, I myself characterized it this way at the beginning of this talk. But the key question I want to emphasize is whether our understanding of history as progressive, let's say, can be merely retrospective or whether it must also be prospective to have the desired practical and emancipatory effect. And on this point, I want to insist Hegel and Marx disagreed. And Jaeggi, despite her occasional suggestions to the contrary, seems to side with Marx rather than with Hegel. Okay, so turning now to my third section, I'll be trying to articulate what I see as a political deficit in this version of a praxis model of history. So in her essay, The Concept of History, Hannah Arendt describes the difference between Hegel's and Marx's conceptions of history in precisely these terms. Hegel contended that judgments about progress, as Arendt eloquently puts it, quote, revealed themselves only to the backward glance of the historian and philosopher, end quote. This meant, according to Arendt, that it never occurred to Hegel to use the concept of history as a prospective, forward-looking principle for action. Marx, by contrast, did precisely this when he turned the Hegelian notion of history into the basis for his understanding of revolutionary politics. In this regard, Marx made a fundamental error, according to Arendt. He attempted, as she puts it, to, quote, escape from the frustrations and fragility of human action by construing it in the image of making, end quote. Arendt thus accuses Marx of attempting to derive politics from history. At the same time, what unites Hegel and Marx, indeed what is definitive of the modern concept of history for Arendt, is the idea of history as a process. Here is Arendt, quote, the fundamental fact about the modern concept of history is that it arose in the same 16th and 17th centuries, which ushered in the gigantic development of the natural sciences, end quote. The core of the modern view of history for Arendt is neither teleology nor a stadial account of historical development. Rather, at its core is a realignment of the relationship between nature and history that is encapsulated in the assumption that scientific knowledge rests on understanding how something came to be. Whereas the key to the connection between nature and history in antiquity was immortality, in the modern era, according to Arendt, quote, the connection lies in the concept of process, end quote. Ideas of stadial development and teleological progress can thus be understood as specific instances of this modern processual notion of history. They are not coextensive with it. As Arendt proclaims, quote, the modern concept of process pervading history and nature alike separates the modern age from the past more profoundly than any other single idea, end quote. Moreover, according to Arendt, quote, the very idea of history as a process suggests that in their actions, men are led by something of which they are not necessarily conscious and which finds no direct expression in the action itself, end quote. In other words, implicit in the idea of history as a process is a kind of cunning of reason view that Arendt suggests that Kant and Vico had already anticipated, but that Hegel and Marx developed further. On such a view, the logic of history proceeds, much like the infamous invisible hand of the market, working behind the backs and above the heads of individual actors, who remain oblivious to this logic even as they unwittingly advance it through their actions. The result of this process-oriented view for Arendt is to subsume action, which is the core of politics, into a historical logic that cancels out its inherent messiness, uncertainty, and unpredictability. So with Arendt's reflections as a backdrop, we can return to the three objections to the praxis-oriented view of history that I outlined above. And those were historical determinism, objectivism, and Eurocentrism. So I want to return to those objections to assess Jaeggi's version of the praxis-oriented view. And what I want to argue is that although Jaeggi largely succeeds in responding to worries about the alleged historical determinism and Eurocentrism that plague Marx's view of the praxis-oriented account, the centrality of the idea of a logic of history in her account leaves her open to worries about objectivism. Putting this in terms of Arendt's argument, we could say that there is a residual version of the cunning of reason view in Jaeggi's account, even if she certainly offers a more plausible, more pluralistic and open-ended, less substantialist, deterministic, and Eurocentric version of this story than Marx or Hegel. So Jaeggi consistently attributes the ability to solve problems, expand or enrich self-understanding, and learn not to agents or groups of agents, but rather to forms of life themselves. And I think this is an aspect of review that is sometimes not fully appreciated, actually. Indeed, as she makes clear in an exchange with Robin Selicates, this is an intentional choice. That is, the attribution of the ability to solve problems to forms of life themselves is an intentional choice. As she puts it, quote, "It is the social formation itself here that undergoes a learning process. This is a moderately holistic claim. It is not individuals and then an aggregation of individuals who have learned something. It is the form of life itself that has," end quote. So hers is a pragmatist materialist view that is designed to pull focus away from the subjective dimension of social struggles, a focus that leads to what Jaeggi calls, quote, "an all too voluntarist understanding of social change and progress," end quote, and redirect it toward the objective dimension of crisis tendencies, what she calls, quote, "the imminent crises of social formations that lead to social change," end quote. Noting, correctly, I think, the centrality of the idea of objective crises to Marx's own theory of history, Jaeggi claims that it is his insight, quote, "into the double aspect of social revolutions and social transformation and change that is the most productive side of Marx's theory of revolution," end quote. Now, to be clear, in drawing out an Arendtian worry about this account, I am not accusing Jaeggi of historical determinism. Indeed, I think that she is a nuanced and thoughtful reader of what she calls the double aspect of Marx's account of social transformation. That is the complex interplay between the passive and active poles of social change. And it must be said, even Marx's view is more subtle than critics like Arendt gave him credit for. On the passive side, for Jaeggi, forms of life change over time in ways that lead them to become dysfunctional, either because they are unable to solve problems that have emerged, generating a crisis, or because a set of social practices within them systematically undermines itself, leading to a contradiction. In order for a social change to occur, these passive crises and contradictions must be turned into active conflicts or disagreements between groups of social actors who then press for change. Following Hegel's notion of the world historical individual and Marx's account of the revolutionary proletariat, Jaeggi argues that the resulting social changes are achieved neither purely actively nor purely passively. Social actors generate change by, quote, "realizing history's latent tendencies and possibilities," or acting upon the tendencies of the time to channel them into a viable future, end quote. There is no inevitability here, at least not any that could be divined ahead of time. As Jaeggi puts it, quote, "only in retrospect does this intervention seem inevitable," end quote. And yet, as Jaeggi insists several times throughout the book, quote, "social transformations do not come from nowhere, in that they emerge out of a breakdown in existing practice and institutions when confronted with problems they can no longer solve," end quote. So what I want to suggest is that her conception of a multidimensional historical logic that proceeds according to its own internal rationality leans so far toward the objective dimensions of historical dynamics, crises, and tendencies that it ends up, perhaps unwittingly, with a reified view of political action. The problem with identifying historical tendencies and projecting them into the future, as Arendt already saw, is that such an approach misunderstands the singularity and unrepeatability of historical events. With Arendt, we might say that even a weak historical logic, to the extent that it relies on the identification of historical tendencies, denies the possibility of, quote, "events in the sense of something irrevocably new," end quote. And insofar as political action is, for Arendt, quote, "essentially always the beginning of something new," end quote, the adherence to such a logic also denies the very possibility of political action. There is thus, at least I want to argue, a distinctively Arendtian political deficit in Jaeggi's account. Let's see here. And I think this tendency toward objectivism resurfaces in Jaeggi's discussion of political conflict. As I've already said, Jaeggi emphasizes that social change does not come out of nowhere. Rather, it is prompted by the fact that something in the form of life isn't working, has become dysfunctional, or is otherwise breaking down. Thus, social change for Jaeggi is, quote, a crisis-ridden problem-solving process, and this accounts for its dynamism as well as its directionality, end quote. Now, properly speaking, Jaeggi reserves judgments of progress for what she calls second-order problems. That is, problems concerning the cultural or conceptual resources that forms of life draw on to address their first-order problems. So, for example, anthropogenic climate change poses a first-order problem for contemporary forms of life, threatening the stability of our ecosystems and thus the habitability of our planet. But progress is the second-order matter of whether societies can develop adequate responses to this first-order problem. In other words, progress in this domain is a matter of whether forms of life, quote, have the institutional resources and levers needed for initiating problem-solving processes. The question is thus not whether they actually, sometimes or frequently, solve problems, or even whether they sometimes or frequently learn from those problems. The question is whether they have learned to learn, end quote. Progress refers then to the ongoing development of reflexivity in a form of life's problem-solving skills. Now, this way of understanding progress gives rise to a question about the role of social struggles and conflicts in this developmental process. Although talk of problem-solving processes might seem to imply a neat, rational, and cooperative process of collective learning, Jaeggi emphasizes that problem-solving on her account is marked by internal conflict and contestation. In fact, conflict enters into her account in two ways. First, she allows room for conflicts and disagreements not only over how to solve problems, but also over, quote, both what constitutes a problem, a contradiction, or a crisis, and about what it might take to resolve it, end quote. And even at the meta level about, quote, who decides what a problem is and how do they decide it, and what are the success criteria for a solution, end quote. These are what I call conflicts of interpretation. Second, as I discussed a moment ago, she argues that social change occurs when objective or passive problems, crises, and contradictions are transformed into active conflicts in which social actors press for change. In so doing, as Jaeggi explains, quote, social conflicts and struggles contribute to changing the aggregate state of latent crises or signs of erosion, end quote. Such conflicts, which occur not at the level of interpretation, but rather on the plane of action, can also be judged, according to Jaeggi, based on whether they, quote, react appropriately to problems and crises or perpetuate or produce blockages to experience and learning, end quote. In other words, Jaeggi's account of progress and regression explicitly makes space for the role of conflict and struggle in social change. However, because Jaeggi contends that it is forms of life themselves and not groups of social actors or members of social movements who learn and progress, conflicts of action end up being subsumed within this objective process. Even if she understands this in a rather loose way, according to which, quote, the new novel social practice institution or formation and the new understanding of these practices is the result of a directed transformation within a constellation that emerges from the contradictions, disrupted relations of fit, and or signs of erosion of the old order, end quote. It is still the form of life whose learning is enriched or whose experience is qualitatively deepened in cases where this process can be called progressive. Again, my point here is not that Jaeggi's view is determinist. She is consistent and clear that even if, quote, there are preconditions for certain possibilities arising in the first place, there is nothing inevitable about any particular possibility becoming reality, end quote. There is room for contingency in her account, just not for arbitrariness. As she says, quote, things could always have turned out differently, end quote. A tellingly objectivist formulation in and of itself. And finally, I'll just say a couple of words about the question of Eurocentrism. As I argued above, Jaeggi's project explicitly aims to reconstruct the notion of progress in a way that is responsive to concerns of Eurocentrism, while at the same time avoiding the dangers of contextualism and relativism. And given that her account of progress is inherently pluralistic, multidimensional, and not explicitly tied to the normative content of European modernity, I think she largely succeeds in this respect. Her view is certainly substantially less Eurocentric than Hanet's, I think, to say nothing of Hegel or of Marx. But if it turns out that her criteria for progress may not be quite as thin and formal as she imagines, then this would open the door for worries about whence their substance is derived. And here I think Arendt's remarks on the ways in which the notion of process is central to the modern conception of history and concomitant with the rise of modern science are really telling. Because if Arendt is right that the notion of process is central to the modern conception of history, then that would suggest that Jaeggi's account of progress is quintessentially modern as well. Okay, and now I will turn to the last concluding section of my talk. So I want to come back to the third model, the third way of understanding the value of history for critical theory, what I called problematization, and try to offer just a few brief considerations in its favor, since I have up to now only just poked holes in the first two accounts. So at first glance, there are some interesting convergences, I think, between Jaeggi's pragmatist, materialist, problem-solving perspective and the problematizing view of history that I sketched above. First and foremost, both obviously place the notion of problems at their center, and they also share an understanding of problems as having both an active and a passive side or pole, we might say. As Colin Copeman has argued persuasively, Foucault's problematizing approach to history understands problems as both made and found. So Foucault focuses on madness, criminality, sexuality, and biopolitics because these have become problems for us. In that sense, they're found. And at the same time, he actively problematizes these formations, and in that sense, these problems are made. As such, I think the problematizing approach is attentive to the complex ways that problems are made up of interconnected webs of practices, institutions, power relations, and discourses. So, for example, we might say that the problem of punishment is comprised of a web of interconnected disciplinary and normalizing practices, carceral institutions such as prisons, factories, and schools, legitimating discourses of liberty and property, and so on. And in this sense, I think the problematizing view also has what Jaeggi calls a materialist moment that illuminates the interconnections between different aspects or modes of social change. Moreover, that problems are both made and found in the problematizing view provides an interesting and clear echo of Jaeggi's discussion of the active and passive poles of problem solving as the motor of social change. However, there is a key difference, which is that the pragmatist view aims to identify successful problem solving processes, while the problematizing view aims to articulate, dynamize, and intensify problems in the present. As such, it has the specifically political aim of opening up concrete spaces of freedom. In other words, for the problematization view, as I've already indicated, history is always and only history of the present. The idea of uncovering a logic of history that allows us to identify historical tendencies that tell us which way social change is likely to move has no place here. For the problematizing view, the point of historical or genealogical reflection is to do something in the present, namely to free ourselves up with respect to some aspect of our historical a priori or form of life, so that we can think and act differently. And I think if we consider one of Jaeggi's favored examples of progress from the book, we can see why the problematizing approach might be fruitful. So Jaeggi contends that moral progress does not occur in a vacuum, but rather is part of deeper changes of social practices and forms of ethical life. In other words, moral change is always social change. As an example, she considers the moral revolution in how we understand slavery, a revolution from a time when it was widely considered morally acceptable to a present where that view has become unintelligible. As Jaeggi puts it, quote, treating a human being as private property, treating someone as something, is then not more or less reprehensible than cheating, robbing, or murdering them. To the extent that we have put slavery behind us, it is a category mistake. Transitioning from one ethical context to another thus clearly involves replacing an entire epistemic and normative framework, end quote. So in that sense, the pressing question that slavery poses for Jaeggi's theory of progress concerns how we should understand, quote, the transition from a moral frame of reference in which slavery comes across as perfectly natural and morally neutral to one in which it is a shocking moral scandal, end quote. So the problem-solving approach thus encourages us to think of slavery as a historical problem that has been solved, even if only provisionally and incompletely. And Jaeggi, of course, acknowledges that de facto forms of slavery still exist in the world. And even as we acknowledge that its solution has created new problems. And again, Jaeggi acknowledges that the structures of racist oppression and expropriation outlived the abolition of chattel slavery in the form of Jim Crow and mass incarceration. But notice that this way of thinking not only implies that we, and I think one can ask who precisely is the relevant we here, have learned that slavery was wrong, a claim that if it was ever plausible, is if intended as a claim about the United States as a whole, has in recent years become increasingly difficult to justify. I'm sorry to say. But more fundamentally, this view implies that slavery is past. On the other hand, adopting a problematizing approach to the history of slavery and emancipation enables us to see the ways that we continue to live with the afterlife of slavery, as Saidiya Hartman would say, or in the wake of it, as Christina Sharp would put it. So now returning briefly to the three criticisms of the problematizing view of history that I discussed at the outset, and this will be my concluding remarks. The problematizing view of history does not so much deny that history has any meaning as it anchors this meaning firmly in the present, in the context of ongoing social and political struggles. As Michel Rolph-Troyot argued in his classic book, Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History, the term history encodes at least two distinct meanings. On the one hand, history refers to the past understood as a socio-historical process. On the other hand, it refers to the story we tell ourselves and each other in the present about that process. Troyot labels these historicity 1 and historicity 2. For Troyot, the way out of the false antithesis of positivism, which maintains that history is a matter of uncovering objective truths about the past, and constructivism, which maintains that history is a fiction, is, quote, the realization that historical production is itself historical, end quote. The past is not a fixed, stable, and independent reality that is retrieved through the work of history. As Troyot says, quote, the past does not exist independently from the present, end quote. Rather, the past exists only in virtue of and in relation to the present. Thus, the constitution of subjects of history goes hand in hand for Troyot with the continuous creation of the past. And this means that we are not successors of our pasts. We are contemporaneous with them. Our pasts are constantly changing as they are renegotiated in the present through ongoing social and political struggles. Relatedly, rather than offering orientation for the directionality of our practical struggles, problematization is designed to have a practical effect. Problematization reveals not only that our present problems are contingently made up, and thus that they could be otherwise, but also how they had been made up through complex ensembles of practices, institutions, and discourses. Thus, it helps us to imagine how they could be otherwise. In other words, problematization not only opens up a space for thinking and acting differently, it also elaborates concrete forms of counterconduct in the present. And this is what Daniela Lorenzini has called its possibilizing effect. In this sense, problematization does have a kind of practical payoff, but not in the form of providing roadmaps or orienting us with respect to historical tendencies that push in the direction of social change. Rather, it offers tools for those who fight. And finally, taking seriously the ways in which our own thinking, even and perhaps especially our thinking about history, is historically conditioned, means that we must learn how to think without a banister, as Arendt would say. From this point of view, as Adorno has suggested, relativism becomes a pseudo-problem that emerges only as the flip side of a wish for transcendent moral absolutes. Once we learn to live without the latter, we can give up worrying about the former. But this is the same, I think, as embracing some form of contextualism. And moreover, we might ask ourselves why critical theorists, such as Jaeggi and also Hannett, are so worried about the dangers of contextualism. Unlike traditional theory, isn't critical theory always already on a side? The side of the oppressed, the marginalized, and the dominated? Emancipation from oppression is, after all, the practical intent of its theoretically informed histories of the present. Critical theorists are not detached or neutral. We are connected to and committed to the ongoing emancipatory social and political struggles that we theorize. In other words, we are engaged participants in an ongoing conflict of interpretation of moral and social norms, political principles, and historical self-understandings. Why then would we need a context transcendent normative foundation, however thin and formal it may be, to justify which side we are on? To whom do we think such justifications need to be offered? Thank you.